Professor Downs really needs no introduction in Barbados. And again, we've presented his information for you, and it just remains for me to say, Professor Downs, that we are honored to have you deliver the CICMC Inaugural Lecture this evening. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Downs to deliver his lecture. He's billed for 45 minutes, and I'm sure that he will be well within that. He's going to use a PowerPoint presentation, and so you all can follow what he's saying. And I would now like to ask Professor Downs to join me. Good night to all. Thank you, Basil, for introduction. I like them when they're short so that we can get on to the real music of the night. First of all, let me acknowledge Ambassador Bobby Morris and the other panelists, Lynette and Roger, and also Senator Watson, who I haven't had a chance to congratulate yet for his elevation. And we look forward to hearing you on all the business things coming forward very shortly. Let me also, before I start, congratulate those who are being involved in the development of this organization, the Caribbean Institute of Certified Management Accountants. I guess I'm a management accountant, so I have to become certified to join this organization. Oh, just a consultant's part, no problem. But my brother who's involved in this, and it's always difficult to say no to brothers who you've lived with all your life. I had fortunate to be in the country today, so I couldn't say no to such an exercise. So I'm here to say a few words within the 45-minute span that I've been allotted to highlight a few items, because certainly a topic of this nature can be technical one, and also can be very detailed, but I will try to highlight what I consider to be the main issues involved in the process of accelerating growth in the Barbadian economy, and more specifically why we need to accelerate, because it suggests to me that it has not been accelerated, and therefore we need. And I will show you why that is so graphically, and also explain the process. So my presentation, therefore, would be in three parts. First of all, I want to provide a framework for analyzing economic growth in a small economy like ours. I know that recently there's been a lot of contention about the whole question of simulating, involving sort of simulating the economy in various ways, and reasons why we have to be very cautious in a small developing country. And there are reasons for that. I will highlight those particular reasons. Then I want to look at the growth experience of Barbados since the 1960s, because it provides a very sharp picture of what we really need to do, where we've come from since the 60s to now, and where we need to get back up to going forward. And therefore, finally conclude with an outline, really an outline of some strategies and policies for promoting or accelerating, depending on how you look at it, economic growth in the Barbadian economy. Let me first start with what I mean by economic growth, because sometimes it's always good to be very clear about what we're talking about so that we don't get sidetracked. It's almost like when we're talking about inflation, the same idea of whether we growth, inflation, unemployment, all these terms need to be first defined so that we're all on the same page. And I define economic growth as the continuous increase in the production of goods and services within the country. And usually as economists, we tend to measure that by the value of the total production that takes place within the geographical boundaries of a country. And that's what we call the gross domestic product. Of course, value has a price dimension to it, along with the actual production of goods and services. And what we need to do is to adjust the value of the goods and services produced and usually current prices by deflating or removing the price effect, so that we talk about real GDP or constant price GDP. So when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about changes in the real GDP of a country or the constant price value of it. not the current price. And I always tell people that don't be deceived by that one. You look in the statistics for a constant price value, or what we call the real value of the gross domestic product. And what we're talking about is also the long-term trend in the production of goods and services, not necessarily the blips that occur. We're talking about the long-term trend in economic growth, and you'll see why I will focus on that particular point later on. Because when I talk about acceleration, really and truly is that the next derivative of velocity. You want to make sure that you go up with the speed up, so to speak, for those who are mathematically inclined. So we have, therefore, in looking at the growth process, that faster than this is going faster than I would like. Okay, oops. Right. So one can have, therefore, in terms of economic growth, the production of more existing goods and services. That is, you can produce more chairs that you're producing already, more oranges, more haircuts, and so forth. Or you can produce, in terms of economic growth, new goods and services altogether. And there's a distinction there, because in many respects, when we talk about the whole question of innovation, entrepreneurship, research and development, we're really looking for new goods that we want to produce. And invariably, when we talk about what we call expanding the production possibility frontier, in large measure, we're talking about producing new goods, pushing forward. In many respects, sometimes the dynamics of economic growth involves the process whereby some things will have to die in order for others to live. And therefore, we call that essentially in the growth process what we call the creative destruction process, where you have a sunset industries or sectors or even institutions will die off and allow the creation of new ones. And you see when I come to strategies that we need to do a lot more of that in order to accelerate economic growth in a larger sense. So why this whole big hullabaloo about economic growth? That is, in terms of the production of more goods and services, we certainly need to do it in order to improve the general livelihoods of persons. That is, the more goods are produced, the more people can consume, and the more you have to distribute across a really wider range of persons. Of course, it can also lead to the reduction of poverty. It can really, and that's an important element of poverty reduction, that we need to get economic growth going, and also employment creation, and also the general socio-economic development of a country. When we talk about, and other elements that I can also discuss later on. But certainly, there are significant benefits to economic growth. To government, economic growth is also important, because certainly that also means increased taxation. Because as the economy grows, certainly, even if you don't change the tax rate, essentially what happens is that you have more revenue coming in as more activity takes place and more growth occurs in the economy. So that's those particular elements there. So let me move, therefore, to a small developing country like Barbados. The question is, how do we situate this whole question of production of goods and services? And I've identified, which is fairly standard, the three markets in which we can promote economic growth. And later on, when I come to strategies, I would want to distinguish where we want to focus certain activities in relation to the domestic market. There's some goods and services that are geared strictly for the domestic market. In many cases, we call that a non-tradable commodity for reasons, the fact that they can't be transported elsewhere, or if they can be transported, it is almost infinite cost. The regional goods and services, the regional market, and also the extra-regional market. These are really when you talk about outside. And again, we will come back to that distinction between the three markets, because in some cases, you'll find that the exportation to either regional market or extra-regional market might be better, it might be advantageous to start in the domestic market, get yourself wet first, and then move on to the next stage. There's what we call the stage approach to economic growth. So for a small economy, and it's important that we understand what it means by a small economy. And I've defined it here because we tend sometimes to go to the characteristics of the small economy before effectively dealing with some of the definition issues. And here, I want to focus on two aspects of defining a small economy. First of all, what we call the numerical size of the economy, either in terms of the number of persons that occupy that economy, the geographical area in which it is occupied, and essentially whether the market itself. In many respects, when we talk about economic activity, we tend to focus on the domestic market. And the reason for that, certainly, is that we have a situation where small economies, which tend to be at the lower end of the spectrum of these particular variables, whether it is population size, land area, and so forth. And it's always difficult to pin down what is small. I remember very distinctly when I went to do my PhD in Manchester many moons ago. The first thing one of my supervisors said, who was a statistician, well, what do you mean by small developing country? And I, goofed around and said, well, 1,000, a million person, less than a million person, less than 5 million persons, and so forth. And he was never satisfied with that. The economist was, in my panel, was satisfied, but the statistician was. And I spent a whole year learning multivariate statistics to satisfy just him alone. In the sense, therefore, that I had to show in a statistical way, essentially, how do we get to defining a small economy, utilizing those particular variables. And there are statistical techniques for doing that in a formal way. But the important point of measuring, of making this particular point, which I will come back to over and over again, is that the small size, from this numerical perspective, have implications for the economies of scale, that is the ability to lower the production costs of goods and production costs of goods and services, or the unit cost of goods and services over time, and also economies of scope, the ability to do a number of things and lower costs at the same time. And we find, therefore, that in this particular regard, the whole question of exports becomes very critical when we define economic growth as the small economy in this way. We find, as we will see through this whole thing, and as some of my own colleagues have emphasized over the past few months, that the foreign exchange constraint is particularly critical in small economies like ours. We need foreign exchange for almost everything we consume, and for almost everything that we produce in such economies, and therefore, in order to get that foreign exchange, therefore, we have to export in some form or fashion in small economies. But an important element of a small economy that sometimes is ignored is the degree of power, economic power, that a small economy has. And in many cases, small economies have very little power in terms of the ability to influence things in the international market, especially. This power is essentially limited. People argue that the small economies can even despite they have limited power, might very well need to be smart in how they do things. But certainly in many regards, the whole question of negotiating and bargaining and the need for strategic alliances, such as, for example, economic integration, becomes important in terms of small economies. So if you combine, therefore, the numerical size of the small economy along with the economic power aspect of the small economy, therefore we have a sense of the sort of characteristics that a small economy would display in various forms. And I've listed them out here. A high degree of openness, in the sense, therefore, as I said earlier, because of the small size, you find that a lot of the whole question of trade becomes important, both exports and imports. And insofar that you have to import goods for consumption purposes and production purposes, you therefore also have to export goods in order to get the foreign exchange to buy those imports. So it's critical that that is done. And in many respects, it's also important in terms of investment and price-taking behavior. That is, in many respects, you don't have much negotiating power, so therefore we have to take prices whether it's imports or exports. And this brings an important point here, that in many cases, a lot of the inflation that we experience in economies like ours is essentially imported type inflation. We take the prices and you have very, very little room for maneuver in many respects, especially if they increase it on you. Of course, there's also the issue of limited production diversification. We have a very concentrated production platform along with exports. And of course, as I said earlier, it raises issues of the whole question of ability to lower costs of production and also to widen the scope of activity across a different set of areas that we're dealing with. Of course, also there's a limited capacity for institutional capacity, especially when it comes to the critical mass. You'll find in some situations, therefore, that in small economies such as ours, the number of specialists that you find are very limited, sometimes non-existent. If you go to some countries in the OECS, for example, you might not find a neurosurgeon, because the extent to, even in Barbados, there's only one, possibly two neurosurgeons existing. So you can see a sense that whereas in large countries you have a minor population to draw on, you have a critical mass to employ persons on an ongoing basis. And also the whole question of small economies, especially those that are in the sort of geographical belt that we are in, are subject to environmental shocks. There's a vulnerability to external shocks, and we must always be mindful of that, because certainly what that is going to have implications for is what I'm going to call later on risk mitigation in terms of the whole question of the growth process, because you'll find, therefore, that one shock to an economy can dislocate that economy for a long time, and therefore it takes a very long time to get back onto that growth path that you're talking about. So therefore, clearly, we must always be mindful of that particular variable. And also the whole question of dependence on the need, therefore, in many cases, to be dependent either structurally or functionally in terms of where we do things going forward. Now, I draw on a text that I was former director of the Arthur Lewis Institute of Social Studies University. And Arthur Lewis has been part of my life for a long time, and I always go back to his work from time to time. But this is a book he wrote many years ago, The Theory of Economic Growth, which I always suggest to people to go and read when they think they're inventing something new. In terms of growth, that is, because I've been teaching growth theory for a long time, the formal process and also the more policy-oriented ones. And he has identified in that book the main elements, which I'm going to come back to in this lecture later on, in relation to the factors that influence economic growth in a country. First of all, the whole question of savings. That is, a country, in fact, he argued very straightforwardly, that the fundamental problem of economic development is raising the level of savings, or increasing the savings rate in a particular country. And he used an estimate of in the region of 20–25%. And if you look at the Barbados experience, we are well below that in terms of economic growth. Certainly, the whole question of capital accumulation or investment is critical, and the reason there is that you want to save. The savings, therefore, are going to be used to invest. And if there's a savings investment gap, therefore it has to be closed in some way if you want to move forward. And in many respects, that is closed by foreign direct investment. And you find, therefore, for those who still remember the 1960s, and I'm quite sure both Mohammed Nasser and Senator Watson will know this, that certainly the whole question of the industrial manufacturing sector was built around elements of that beehive concept, which came out a lot of Arthur Lewis's work. But also important in terms of going forward economic growth, which is something that is now coming to be very very well discussed in the literature, is the whole question of the growth of knowledge and the application of new ideas. That is, goes back to the whole question of new product development that I mentioned. Remember I said either existing products going forward, or alternatively you can have new investment, new goods being produced, new knowledge, the whole question of new knowledge, the whole question of research and development becomes important. This is where certainly the university becomes critical. The university, for example, let me pause here for a moment. We've been engaged in a wide range of research over the years. And in many respects, that research work tends to end up in an article in a journal, and not into a commercial enterprise. Certainly, there are a number of things that we have discovered through research and development of the university that can go to the commercial level. And we are now trying, certainly in my new portfolio university, trying to commercialize the research work that we are doing in the university going forward, in terms of the range of patents that we have and trying to move those patents in. So if there are businessmen here who have money, and we can put the ideas and the money together, and therefore we can push economic growth in terms of new product development. International trade, as I said earlier, the question of exports, the framework that exists between the public-private sector relations is critical, because clearly how the public and private sector interacts, and what's in terms of regulation, in terms of rules and regulations, procedures becomes important for economic growth. And finally, the whole question of institutions, the existence of property rights, the question of economic freedom, and so forth. There's a classic book, what is called The Mystery of Capital. And the underlying idea of the mystery of capital is that in a number of Latin American countries, and this is why institutions are so important, a lot of people do not have property rights on their assets, their land, for example. They'll be squatting, and therefore they don't have, sorry to say squatting here, but you don't have property rights to the land. And if you don't have property rights to the land, therefore, you can't use the land as an asset or collateral to go and borrow funds. And that's a big problem. So clearly you have to get the property rights first. You have property rights in the land. I can now say, well, I have something to go and share. If I goof, then you can have the land. One of my colleagues at the university, who you know very well, has always said that he argues the case of children going to their parents and saying, well, I have a good idea. Can you go and mortgage the house for me, and so I can put this idea in operation? And just the other day, I was at a meeting, and somebody asked me, with your two sons, if your two sons came to you and asked you, put that to you, would you do it? I think he backed off there from that point, so that was a different story. So the question of property rights becomes important because it allows you to move forward in terms of getting funds that you need. And as I said earlier, a lot of these factors are reflected in the modern research that we are doing in economic growth in the various countries. So if you go back then, roll that back to economic growth in small states, you find then that economic growth in small states is propelled by demand factors, that is, and there's a theory of demand pulling of growth, where your regional and extra-regional exports are going to be pushing your growth process forward. So whatever happens in the regional and export markets in terms of demand for goods and services, if it's either because of the changing in consumer demand patterns in terms of demography, if those things change, therefore, and there's a corresponding demand, we will get an expansion in economic growth. There's also the supply side factors, which are particularly important because you have, therefore, to have the availability and the quality of the human resources to get things going along with the infrastructure and the capital investment. And I'm going back again to the whole question of the social and economic institutions. And as I will say later on, the government policies and regulations. The last two tend to be more what we call the soft side of the growth process. The things, the quality of the institutions, whether the unions are doing things right and they're non-adversarial, if the public sector is efficient, these are and whether government policy is hitting the right chords and so forth. These are tended to be softer sides of it, but critical to the whole process to support the top two, which are really what we can call the hardcore elements of the growth process. So if you look at the research work, and I'll come to this end shortly, the research work in economic growth in small states in Caribbean, some of which I've done myself, point to a number of drivers and a number of constraints to the growth process that we must identify. And this is empirical research that has looked at all a number of countries in the region and using different methodologies, and they've come, and these are more or less the somewhat robust type results that have come out of this particular research. Foreign exports becomes a main driver, whether it's tourism, whether it's minerals, whether it's financial services or agricultural production. Foreign direct investment, especially, as I said earlier, especially in terms of closing the gap between the savings and investment, because if domestic savings are low relative to the investment that is needed, that gap is closed by a foreign direct investment element. Human capital, especially the whole question of skilled labor and the role of education and training, and most importantly, financial resources in terms of this credit, domestic credit. But there are certain constraints, that is, things that retard the process of economic growth. And we find, therefore, that issues of inflation, which can create high levels of uncertainty in the economy, the question of debt, the external debt growth, especially the debt overhang, which essentially removes resources from the economy, and therefore that can either be used, which have what we call a high opportunity cost, can create problems, because in turn you have to service debt. That means the resources that are being used to service the debt that can be used elsewhere. And clearly, if you accumulate debt either by increasing your fiscal deficit significantly over time, and your external or domestic debt grows, therefore you're going to find a situation where it can retard growth, either by the public sector crowding out private sector investment, because they're going into the capital market to borrow funds, or ultimately situations where there's a high opportunity cost. The whole question of volatility in the economy and uncertainty creates problems. The question also government intervention, certain tax systems can distort the economic activity and create a drag on economic growth. And of course, as I said earlier, external shocks to the system, whether it's hurricanes or price hikes and so forth. So to conclude, therefore, on this section, what we can say, therefore, that in terms of a framework for analyzing economic growth in countries like ours, and more sometimes generally, is that these factors that we've identified point to the importance of international trade being important, more specifically exports propelling economic growth. And the challenge we have in terms of a strategy going forward, how then do we get exports going? Education and training being critical. How do we create the right type of persons at the right level and right quality to enhance the economic growth process? Macroeconomic stability, whether it's in terms of inflation, whether it's in terms of interest rate policy, whether it's in terms of fiscal deficits, becomes important. The role of the state and the government policies, the extent to which government is going to be involved in the state activity, which can sometimes retard the process, not that it makes a fundamental difference whether it's private or public sometimes, but certainly in some areas of activity where the state might be an inefficient user of resources, it needs to be pulled out rather than be pushing on the growth process. And of course, the quality of institutions becomes important. And as I said earlier, because of the vulnerability of small economies like ours to shocks, various external shocks, especially environmental shocks, risk mitigation factors become important. And that's why questions of housing, making sure that you satisfy certain housing requirements and so forth becomes important in a broader perspective of economic growth. So given that that background, let me just move to the growth experience of Barbados going back to the 1960s. And if one looks at the international profile of Barbados, you would think that Barbados has no problem talking about economic growth. We are well up there, but I would bring later on a paradox which we are trying to explain in relation to economic growth and the Barbadian type economies. Now, the international profile of Barbados speaks to it being a high-income, non-OECD country by the World Bank, so therefore we have actually graduated from any sort of soft loans from the World Bank. So if you need to borrow funds from the bank, unless they establish a special facility for such economies, or you therefore have to borrow at regular interest rates. It is also regarded as a very high human development country, as determined by the Human Development Index. It is ranked very highly by the Global Competitiveness Report for the fourth, the most recent report available is for the fourth out of 144 countries. And in many cases, it is in terms of even the Global Competitive Report, which is produced by the World Economic Forum, it has made a transition. The forum speaks to 3 stages of economic development. The first stage is based essentially on what we call factor endowments. This is really heavily based on on land and related type activities, countries that are heavily based in that. Then there's an efficiency stage, and then the highest stage of development is the innovation stage. And Barbados has made the transition from the efficiency stage, which focuses on efficient production and quality products, according to the World Economic Forum. I still have my doubts about that. But to the innovation stage, which focuses on the uniqueness of products and so forth. We always have arguments with, although I must say that I was involved in some of the work done by the World Economic Forum for the competitive index, but certainly the final product need not be mine, and I can disown my thinking and thoughts on the issue. But be that as may, I say that as international profile, and that's what the international community will see Barbados as. So if you look therefore at the growth, the production of goods and services in Barbados since the 1960s, you see therefore that in terms of real GDP, remember you're talking about the adjusted for inflation, it rose from about $360 million in 1960 to just over $1 billion in the year 2011, which is a substantial increase over time. It gives us an average growth rate, average annual growth rate of 2.4%. Per annum over the period, which is relatively low when you think about it. And I'll show you why that is so in a moment. If one adjusts it for population growth, which is in the order of 0.3% over the period, we have a per capita income growth in the region of 2.1%, which in many cases is not as high as one would really like for an economy really wanting to grow. In fact, I would argue later on that the acceleration of economic growth, in order to achieve poverty reduction, improving the quality of life, reducing employment, needs a growth rate much higher than 2.1%. But certainly, that is what we are seeing from the statistics. And over the period, since the 1960s, we have seen, therefore, although we've had that general upward trend, we've seen some blips in the economy, some severe, some not severe. The 1970s, there was the oil shock, again in 81, then we had one in 1992 recession, 2001 was the New York, September 11th experience. Of course, we're into the Great Recession in recent times, the most recent one. So in many respects, a lot of the shocks that have occurred to the Barbadian economy have been induced, and I said induced. Sometimes it can be, you can start the process, but it can be multiplied further by domestic response in some cases. And in some cases, I won't specify which particular years, in my view, it was exaggerated by the wrong domestic policies. But that's another example. So if we want to get a sense of the process of economic growth, this picture here tells 1,000 words. This one. What I've done is to take the growth, and I use more, this is since 1974, so, yeah, 74 when we've collected more refined statistics. And what this points to is the fact that we have seen these cycles in economic activity, in economic growth since the 1970s. I've used what we call a moving average, which is the heavy line, the heavy dark line, moving average of economic growth. And that heavy moving average tells us that we've had, if I use a longer period, the cycles will even be more exaggerated. But certainly we see is cycles which points to a certain degree of volatility in the growth process of Barbados over the period of time. So Barbados has been subject to a high degree of volatility since the mid-1970s in its economic growth process. But more importantly, certainly for this lecture, is that you're seeing, you see that line going through it, the trend has been downwards. This suggests, therefore, that the growth process has been starting to be reduced, going down. And it tells us something. Something is wrong. We need, therefore, this is where the acceleration. Now, you can be an economic statistician and say, well, the economy has moved to our services and there are problems associated with measuring services are distinct from measuring agricultural products. That might be one explanation. But I don't think that it is that will have some weight, but not a strong high weight in my view. And certainly what we're seeing, therefore, is a general decline in economic activity, in economic growth over time. And I'm going to have another diagram later on which will reinforce that particular point when it goes even back to the 1960s for a reason that I will explain. So if I look, therefore, at the general declining trend of economic growth in Barbados since the 1960s, what we find is that the golden age, as we call it in economic growth, was in the 1960s. The 1960s, we found very high rates of economic growth. It was averaging in the 60s about 6%. And then we've seen a general decline over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s to the region where we have the average growth rate in the 70s was about 3%, and we've had, interesting, a decline and then a recovery. In the 1980s, it was just about 1% on average, and they had a decline and again a recovery. In the 1990s, there was a slight improvement, 1.5%, with a decline and then a recovery. And in 2000, we've had the blips up and down going on over the period of time. So we've had a situation, so the first main conclusion that comes out of this that is important for this lecture is that certainly we are seeing in Barbados a general decline in the average growth rate over time. This picture. It is a high degree of volatility in the activity. It's not a nice upward type of time period, so you decline along a trend. And certainly, therefore, if we're going to enhance the economic development of the country, we need, therefore, to certainly get this particular, not accelerate downward, but accelerate to bring the economic growth up and then certainly accelerate it up. So it's like going down and taking off, almost the economic takeoff of the economy. So what we have is a situation where, as I said earlier, Barbados has been experiencing a growth slowdown over the past 5 or so decades. And this particular growth slowdown is usually associated, and I can go into the technicalities of this, about what we call a middle income trap. That is, economies are able initially to move out of a low income to middle income process. But that next step up to the high income is always a little more challenging. There are very few countries that will be able to do that, and to break that barrier, so to speak, and we are. But here you have it here, that Barbados is, and my calculations suggest that we actually on the track, although the paradox we have is that the international profile of Barbados says that we are high income, but the growth process and the calculations suggest that we are somewhere in the middle income track. So therefore, there's a need to increase the acceleration of economic growth to get out of this trap. That is something that would almost, what we call a big push to get us out of this particular process. And this is where the ambassadors and the senators would have to do some hard work. And this is not only CARICOM ones, but the external ones, as I will indicate later on. So what are some of the factors? And I said earlier, the important element in terms of the growth process of Barbados has been the external drivers. And some of the external propellers of economic growth in Barbados have been, certainly in the 1960s and some in the 1970s, we've had preferential prices for sugar and the UK market. We had a protected market, so we could have done well. We know what we were going to get. There was foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector, and that was part of the diversification program. The manufacturing sector really was in its heyday, in my view, in the 70s. To a large extent, we found that economic growth in the main trading partners is an important element, especially effects in tourism, has been a critical element here. And also, when in the heydays of economic integration, although we're talking a lot about single market in economies these days, it certainly, from my experience, is not as effective and as impactful as in the days when we had CRIFTA and CARICOM. So clearly we seem to be doing something wrong with, as we're proceeding. But the important telling story, again, picture tells 1,000 words. What I've done here is to look at economic growth of not only Barbados, but USA, UK, and Canada. And the same cycle downwards is there. That is, there's almost a mirror image in terms of the economic growth of those three main trading partners, USA, UK, and Canada, since the 1960s, that Barbados has followed. And I've done all the statistical work for it, but I don't want to bug you with that. But the picture tells you a lot. That the growth path of Barbados has mirrored a lot of the decline in the economic activity that's taking place in those more traditional trading partners. And that's going to tell another story later on as to, well, if you hang yourself onto the old, remember I talked about creative destruction earlier, if you hang yourself onto those old persons, you will be destroyed. And certainly that may very well be what's happening to Barbados in some measure or the other. So what we're seeing, therefore, is some structural changes that have taken place in the economy, a decline in the contribution of the agricultural sector to real GDP, a relative constancy, and in recent times a decline in the manufacturing sector. We've seen the growth of the new services, especially tourism and business services, and we've experienced, despite the fact that we've had a productivity council, the level of productivity growth has been a problem, not up to the level in which we would like, but certainly challenges that we might need to revisit going forward. As I said earlier, the economic statisticians might say, therefore, that there might be a problem in measuring the services sector production, but given that there's still that problem that we have this low productivity growth, in fact, actually declining in some particular sectors. So whilst Barbados has made the transition from an efficiency-based from a factor-based, that means agricultural type sector in the pre-60s to a services-based sector, we are still having some fundamental problems in the growth process that we have been experiencing. So this quickly to recap, that is to go through some of the factors. Some empirical research has been done in economic growth in Barbados since the 60s. Some work as I have done myself, and others in the Central Bank have also done, and CDB. And what we've identified, therefore, are the same factors that I mentioned earlier. Exports being important, human capital being important, physical capital, especially foreign investment being important, and financial development. So Barbados is very much in the league of small developing countries in terms of the factors which drive the economic growth process. And the constraints are somewhat the same. Inflation that creates uncertainty, interest rate policies that increase the cost of capital, government distortionary policies in terms of where they tax and how they tax is really important. That is, and therefore related to that is the fiscal deficit challenge. But of course, Barbados has had some of those softest things that are important to the growth process in terms of creating the institutional environment, sometimes what we call the social infrastructure elements that exist. social not in terms of physical, but social in terms of the social as it is. You understand social to be. A democratic, a relatively stable, liberal democratic system and philosophy. We've had relatively good governance systems, low levels of corruption and so on, and relatively well-functioning institutions. One might argue that. I said reasonably, so therefore I'm okay with that one. Social partnerships exist. Still some concerns in the social partners, despite the ambassador's views, but that's an issue. High levels of economic freedom, and also the thing that Barbados has been experiencing, that we tend to probably underestimate this last point, is that we've had since the 1940s a consistent development planning process. Whether or not, meaning therefore that we have produced development plans consistently since the 1940s. And that, although we may not stay close to the plans themselves as we should, and use them as effectively as we should, the important thing about development planning is that it certainly gives you an idea to reflect back on where you've gone and provide you with an opportunity to where you're going to go forward. So we've had that opportunity to do that from time to time. Sometimes, therefore, however, we might not have been able to operationalize these development plans as we should in terms of a budgetary policy and other types of policy measures. So, but however, these particular factors create a certain degree of transparency and certainty in economic transactions and allow us to lower transactions costs, which are important to the business process. Again, in terms of the dominance of exports, insofar that exports is a dominant factor in the growth process, we clearly need, therefore, to focus a lot more on the whole question of competitiveness, and more specifically, the role that productivity will play in enhancing competitiveness forward. There are different ways in which certainly you can enhance competitiveness. You can fiddle with the exchange rate in terms of what we call the real effective exchange rate. That is disaster. Not only in fact that we are price takers, but it creates problems for us in terms of capital flight, uncertainty in the exchange rate market. But therefore, in terms of the Barbados' approach to it, in many small developing countries, the approach really to enhancing competitiveness is really going the productivity route, which certainly is the route that we have taken and the one that is justified in this particular regard, and one that I particularly support, not the exchange rate thing, because it can run, as Jamaica has shown, it can run into trouble. But certainly in terms of the global competitive index, which looks at the competitiveness of the country, so to speak, Barbados has also been slipping slightly since it's been involved in this particular index. It was 41st or 41 out of 121 countries in 2006-07, and it slipped slightly to 44th place in the most recently. So we are slipping in terms of our competitiveness as a nation, therefore we need to work on that particular one, which goes back again to the issue of productivity that I mentioned earlier. But also in terms of the competitiveness issue, the report highlights, in other studies that have been done in recent times, a number of factors which influence the doing of business in Barbados, which clearly affects the economic growth process. The Global Competitiveness Index reports since 2006, and I've tried to identify the top 5 main factors since 2006 that influence economic competitiveness and hence therefore influence economic growth. And these tend to be inefficient government bureaucracy, access to finance. I think Basil mentioned that earlier. There's not ability, but access, getting at it. So it's like a glass case, so to speak. You can see it, but you can't get it. That's a different issue. The poor work ethic in the national labor force. And this has been the factor that's these two factors, I must admit, have been around for a very long time. It doesn't seem to me that we've been able to break it back of these 3 factors over the years. So since I've been doing research in economics for the past 3 decades, those factors have always constantly come up as being the factors influencing business in Barbados. So some, we're reinventing the wheel, so to speak. Inefficient government, access to finance, poor work ethic, which spins off into productivity issues. And also added to the list is the whole question of tax rates, inflation, foreign currency regulation. So those are the ones that influence the process going forward. So insofar, therefore, that the private sector is the main driver of economic growth. No, government is not the driver of economic growth in the country. The private sector is. Private sector, to a large extent, constitutes 75, also substitutes 75 to 80% of the total production in the country. Barbados has a distribution of firms which consists of a large number of micro, small, and medium-sized firms and a very few things. So if you look at the distribution, it's very long tail. And those who read the book on the long tail distribution of things understand what I mean in relation to long tail distribution. So therefore, when we look at how these different size operations play out in the growth process, we have therefore to look at the factors which constrain them. And some work that's been done by the World Bank in recent times point to a number of factors, and these are in order of importance by the particular level of company or firm. Small firms, that's in 20, they list electricity as the main factor, so Roger will speak to that point. Access to finance, and inadequate educated labor. In medium-sized firms, they will reverse. Access to finance is the first, followed by inadequate educated labor and transportation. And large firms are talking about educated labor, electricity, and access to finance. So these represent binding constraints on the growth of firms, and hence, therefore, the overall growth process. And what we need, therefore, to do is to be able to remove these particular constraints. The question always arises is, even if you remove these constraints, would new constraints arise? So if I remove these constraints and do a survey 5 years down the road, would I see another 7 new constraints? That's always a problem. But these are the ones that have been identified currently. So these particular, and also I want to add here that in terms of trading, that is engaging in international trade, Barbados still has a long way to go in meeting international standards when we come to talking about the documents and time and cost to export and also to import. That is, whilst we are doing well relative to other Latin American and Caribbean countries, in terms of global competitive standards, we are still a long way to go. So clearly we have a lot to do. So these constraints to firm growth and doing business, therefore, will certainly have to be resolved in order to accelerate economic growth going forward. So let us then move to how then do we, what sort of, and I want to sketch some elements here in relation to accelerating the growth process going forward. And I speak about, certainly when we talk about strategy, we're talking about certainly a plan of action or a set of policies that will allow us to achieve a particular objective going forward. And therefore, we have to make choices as we proceed down the road. Some, we have to make a decision, and therefore that decision certainly has to take various factors into consideration. So in reversing the growth trend and accelerating economic growth, Barbados therefore needs to establish, first of all, what are the long-term goals of economic growth? Why do we need economic growth? And I say so because you have situations where you can talk about poor growth, growth focusing on poverty reduction. You have green growth, focusing on the green economy. You can have gender-based growth, focusing on distribution between males and females and gender relationships. You can have all types of sustainable economic growth, focusing on the environment. So the question is, where do you want to target your growth process? Because certainly the choices that you have to make in terms of economic growth and what you do are going to be important to that basic objective that you set yourself. But we have to make that decision. Certainly you have to identify essentially where you want to go as a long-term goal of vision. Then we need to establish areas for special attention, whether it's the particular industries, sectors, markets, constraints, and then identifying the systems and resources to be able to resolve this particular or facilitate the growth process. Now, in terms of the guidance, that is, in terms of where we want to go as a vision, there are a number of documents that we've produced over the years that can provide elements of that particular vision. The problem you have sometimes is that these documents are produced, but they seem to be forgotten in terms of the operational policy, so to speak, and therefore we lose the vision, lose the goals going forward. But we have a national strategic plan going to the year 2025, which talks about fully developed society that is prosperous, socially just, and globally competitive. We have a medium-term development strategy for Barbados, 2010-14, which supports a large extent the national strategy, which speaks about a number of things, and it talks about economic growth of 3%. Remember I said earlier, we are seeing declining economic growth down to the 1%. So that's a big push-up in terms of going forward. We have a fiscal strategy. This establishes fiscal targets. We have the social partnership protocol, and we just had this throne speech which talks of productivity growth in the region of 2 to 3%, which translate to an economic growth in the order of 3 or 4%. So you have a situation where the Truant speaks is talking about, not quite speaks about productivity growth, but in terms of economic growth as we define it, you're talking about 3 to 4% growth rates from a point where we're way down the line going back up. So we have some challenges going forward. But in moving forward, therefore, what we do in turn have to do is identify where can we get this particular growth process going. As I said earlier, there are a number of markets, there are a number of things, areas that you can focus on. But the signs that gives us the area for moving forward, we have to look at demographic trends. What is changing the economy? We have an aging population. If you have an aging population and a reduction in the youth population, you mean therefore you will have therefore to cater more to older persons, geriatric type activities. If you have a change in consumption patterns, you therefore have to change your production process to fit those consumption patterns. And if there are technological developments, clearly you have to also change your production. So to a large extent, the economic growth process going forward in terms of strategy have to take in consideration demographic trends that we are observing in the economy, changing consumption patterns, technological developments that we are seeing. And what I've done here is to list out a number of particular areas, sectors, that I see important and where we can probably target various markets to enhance the overall growth process. In terms of personal care, and that's cosmetology, right down the whole list, we have a heavy focus on the domestic market, and that can be linked to tourism as a growth area. The cultural and creative sectors, including heritage issues, again, that has a strong emphasis that can be pushed in the regional and international markets. Geriatric care, as I said earlier, domestic market. ICT has an international market. So therefore, you're thinking about pushing production activity in that area. Tourism, hospitality, of course, that's regional, international. The construction sector is domestic, but it has a possible regional market. We are saying, therefore, these are areas of activities that have potential for expansion in different markets as we proceed going forward. Then you have health and wellness and medical tourism, fashion and design, again, international regional market. New agriculture, that is the situation, we have a case where we want to link health and wellness to the agriculture sector that has a domestic and regional focus. And the good thing about having a minister of agriculture who is a doctor, you can see the link, you should be able to see the link and push the link much more. But you'll see what happens going forward, especially when you do a lot of research in diabetes. But that we'll see. And of course, the new manufacturing based on new technologies, again, that has domestic, international, regional, and some international emphasis. The renewable energy will certainly be one in which we're talking about replacement of energy sources domestically, and therefore that has a strong domestic. It has also some regional, international, insofar that you're talking about some aspects of solar energy and others that you can export. Financial services, again, is an area of expansion that we can move in. Natural products research, which is something the university has been pushing. It has an international market, and of course, educational services, and so on. So what I'm saying, therefore, is that we have, in going forward, a number of areas where there's potential for expansion, either in terms of existing goods and services and new goods and services. The question is, therefore, and they have different market targets to identify. The question, therefore, how do we get these things up and running and going forward? So as to push the growth path back up. So the first thing to recognize, and I'm coming to the end shortly, is that what we are observing in the international market, as I said earlier, is what we call a two-speed growth process taking place, where the traditional markets of the United States, UK, Canada, and Europe is at a lower speed than the developing and emerging markets. One is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and some people put S South Africa, but South Africa is still not there yet. Chile, Colombia, Mexico are high growth countries. Interesting enough, if one looks at the Far East, you find that Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand were growing even during the recession period. They were heavy growth areas. People say they ignore those ones either because of this, but we buy cars from Japan. That's a different story. And interesting enough, the UNDP has recognized, therefore, just like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have recognized that there's this two-speed growth process taking place in the international market, have recognized, therefore, that there's now the rise of the South, the rise of developing and emerging countries, and there's the theme of its recent Human Development Report. So therefore, there's something in this that we now need to refocus our attention from the traditional markets, not necessarily to leave them aside, but to refocus our attention as a small economy, because we should be flexible and agile enough to be able to shift around our market. So Barbados needs, as I said earlier, to refocus its orientation to the South. And I remember in my younger days as an economist, when we talk about South-South trade, everybody look at you like you're crazy. But now it's now becoming a reality. That certainly now there's much more growth in the South than it is in the North. And we're seeing that where we need to refocus in that area. In fact, Arthur Lewis made the point, years in the 1950s, that if the Caribbean countries alone can get a very small percentage of the Latin American market, it will be able to resolve almost all its development problems. And you're talking about 5% of the Latin American market with that. So what does Barbados have to do, certainly, to go forward in this particular area? The first thing, I think, is to the diplomats. We need to strengthen our diplomatic and trade relations with their new trading partners, those with our in the growth process. In many cases, that's it. Identifying that particular, what I call the blue ocean strategy. And everyone has read the book on blue ocean strategy. It says essentially what you're talking about is getting into new markets with new products. So nobody in Thailand knows about a Barbadian black belly sheep, I hope, or Barbadian cherry juice, or whatever it is Barbadian products the manufacturers do. So, but certainly that's a new market, unknown. But certainly it will require some work to be done. And this, in many cases, where the diplomatic. Of course, I remember many years ago, in fact, I think when the previous government had started its diplomatic postings, it tended to focus a lot on the economic side of things, whether the nice cocktail parties and so, which are good sometimes. But you want certainly to, for smaller countries, you need to ensure that you make maximum use of your diplomatic links. And therefore, what we need to do is to push the economic side of that particular link more so than the nice cocktail receptions and so forth that we do. But also, in relation to the second thing we need to do, and this is always a worrisome thing, is that we have a number of trading arrangements that we have not made use of. I was involved in a study in the manufacturing sector a couple of years ago. And what essentially came out of that study is that a lot of manufacturers knew something about the EPA and other types of trade arrangement, but they have never done very much in terms of utilizing these particular trade agreements. But there are a number of trade agreements that exist out there that we need to make maximum use of. We need to mine those particular ones a lot more, and that's part of our trading strategy. Of course, we need to strengthen our education system, because we are seeing too much of the situation where a significant part of our labor force, something like over close to 40% of our labor force, has no certification whatsoever, other than birth or baptism certificate, believe it or not. Despite the fact that people claim Barbados is highly educated and all these other things. Yes, we have 100% enrollment in secondary level education. That's fine. I mean, you must go to school because of compulsory education up to 16, 17 in that age. But a lot of people come out of that system with very little certification that is useful for the labor market. And the statistics show clearly that close to 40% is been coming down from much higher players down to that level. But also, there is also a missing middle in there. That is, a lot of those persons that are in that 40% are in what we call elementary occupations. And in the area, which is the technical and vocational area, technicians, you find that there is a very small gap. A recent study done on the Human Resource Development Strategy for Barbados make that point, something that I've observed a long time ago, that it's very difficult to find skilled technicians in many areas. It has almost dwindled. So you have almost a cup where you have the professional top, which is fine, no problem, dwindles, and then big to the bottom in that sort of shape. So we need to therefore focus on the human resource development strategy going forward. To deal with the access to finance, certainly we need to have a development finance strategy. Yes, you may argue, well, do we need another development bank? Well, that's debatable. We can debate that, and I will leave that to the panelists to discuss. But certainly we need to find ways and means to be able to finance enterprises, either by means especially those that are going to generate foreign exchange, or save foreign exchange going forward. Because certainly in terms of access to finance being a critical constraint, you need to resolve that financial constraint in order to enhance economic growth. How we do that, I will leave it to the panelists to say, and we can have a nice discussion, because I know that is always topical. Then we have to, of course, engage in the whole ongoing problem of reforming our regulatory systems to reduce transactions costs, especially in the public sector. That's institutional reform, whether greater use of IT, the greater setting of standards for activities and so forth. The work that's been done on the comparison of Barbados versus other countries show that we are way behind in terms of the whole question of public sector reform and wider institutional reform that we need to do that. Also, we need to incentivize the public sector in many respects in order to get the response that we need out of that particular sector. And finally, of course, in addition to that, that's why I call it the incentive strategy. But also, I think, and this is really, I have a problem sometimes with the private sector. They blame the public sector for everything. But I'm yet to find a document which tells me, and it might be a document, but you'll tell me this later on, that speaks to a development strategy for the private sector. We have a private sector organization, association, with a number of organizations. They all seem to be doing their thing all over the different places. But what I think we need to do is for the private sector to establish a development strategy or a development plan that will say to government, well, look, we want to go in this particular direction, and we want you to facilitate the process. Because if you say to me that you want me to facilitate, so I want to know where you're going first, and I will then help you. But it doesn't seem to work that way in Barbados. They all complain, but we need to focus on that one. Of course, we need to deepen the social partnership, especially at the firm level. Research work that I've been involved in suggests that it's still very much in the macro sphere, and we need, therefore, to enhance that deeper down. That allows us to enhance the productivity, enhance the work ethic that we're talking about in that particular regard. And another element that I think is critical going forward as an important strategy is what we call a coordinating strategy. Now, one of the problems I've found, and this is fundamental to a sort of capitalist system that we operate, that we do not have a coordinating mechanism to allow things to work in a certain way or in a certain direction. It is what we call in economics a coordination failure associated with policy measures and programming when people are doing their own thing. We don't have a coordinated entity in order to push the growth and development process. In the past, we had something called development board that did every single thing. Now we've gone to all separate sorts of separate institutions, and we need to tighten that institutional framework much more than we have. The question arises, do we need Invest Barbados and the BIDC, or we need to have one? I mean, these are issues that we need to discuss, but certainly what we need is some sort of coordinating strategy to allow us to know exactly where we're going, how we're going, and that each person understands that their role in the particular process. I think Basil will tell you about when they had the old BMC, and he had a statistical thing about what we're producing, what we're not going to produce. Things work in the agricultural sector fairly well. I'm not sure he will have a different point. But now you don't have that. Nobody knows what is being produced, how much is being produced. So you therefore get, as my good old friend Marx was saying, these busts and booms in the production cycles and things, without having that coordination. And then finally, straight to Bobby's shoulder, we need therefore to have a regional integration strategy. That is, I still think that Barbados, the regional integration strategy is still very marginal in the process of economic growth and development in Barbados, even in terms of the development plans and so forth. Although Barbados is the lead government in relation to the CICMC, I still think in terms of accelerating production integration, there's a need therefore to have a regional integration strategy that will allow us to do much more in terms of production integration to face international market, and we don't have that. And of course, underlying all of those long-term and medium-term type strategies for economic growth, we certainly to maintain a certain degree of macroeconomic stability to support that growth process. Because if you don't have that, if your exchange rate is all over the place, if your inflation rate is all over the place, if your interest rate is all over the place, you create a high degree of uncertainty, you raise the transactions costs associated with doing economic activity, and then you're all over the place. You can't get the growth that you want. So in conclusion, therefore, several of these elements of this strategy menu, as I said, exist already, and there are elements that don't. So the question arises, what are we doing wrong? Why it is that some of these things are not coming together in such a way that allow us to move that growth process that I said earlier, that I mentioned, that declining growth process to move forward. We have therefore to focus much more on the implementation and monitoring of policies in the medium term so that that long-term process of economic growth will be realized, and therefore we will be able to benefit from that by improvements in our living standards, with increased employment of a productive type, and so forth. So those are some notes that I provided for the growth process that the panelists will be able to discuss and chew on, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say and what you have to say in relation to my presentation. Thank you very much.